Hello. Um, I've been reading about the last lynching in California, at least the last documented lynching. There were reports that there was a lynching in 1947. Um, I want to discuss this a little bit, this particular case. One of thousands, of course, but this was a particularly shocking case, and I want to discuss it a little bit to lay out why I feel that the whole nature of mob justice is absolutely barbaric. I don't want to give a history lesson here about the history of lynchings in the United States. I think I covered that in another video some time ago, and anyone with any sense of history will know that that's a very dark stain on American history. It's also widely considered that these were often against minority Americans, black black men especially. But that wasn't exclusive. There were also white mobs who killed white suspects, as this one seemed to be. But what I find disturbing is that there are people today who actually condone this sort of stuff because of their views on crime. Well, anyone who's followed my channel for a while will know that I've got very strong views on crime. I consider myself socially conservative on crime. But there's something about the nature of those lynchings in the early 20th century that I find stomach churning in their brutality, in their animalistic way that human beings were taken over by mass hysteria. So just going to discuss some basic details of the case, but a particularly shocking aspect of it was the attitude of the governor of the time. And I didn't know any of this until tonight. But basically, I just written down some notes in preparation for this video. So this was 1933. The murder victim was a young heir, Brooke Hart, in San Jose, and he was heir to a department store, as I understand, only 22 years old. He'd been kidnapped, and his body was later found. And apparently, he'd been very popular in the community. So this really incensed sentiments. Bearing in mind this was also around the time of the the Lindbergh kidnapping, or shortly afterwards. So that sort of concept was already an emotive subject. Anyway, the two men who were apprehended, the two accused men, and it's very important here to say accused because this was before they were found guilty in a court of law, were one Thomas Fairmond and one John Holmes. Um, anyway, they were apprehended and put in a cell in San Jose. When the victim's body was discovered, then basically the rumors of what they called a necktie party, which was a euphemism for a lynch mob, developed, and between 6 and 15,000 people attacked the prison and took the men out and hanged them from a nearby tree. It's I believe it was called St James's Park. If any precise details about this are wrong, I take responsibility for that. But the general account is this is what happened. Um, the general account I'm reading out now. Apparently, women were encouraging this. So this animalistic, barbaric bloodlust was not just from men. Women were there, children were there. Apparently, women were dancing, women were fainting, men and women were clawing at the bodies. This was can only be described as animalistic behavior. And it's staggering. Now, at the time, the governor of California was one James Rolfe, who had been the longest serving mayor of San Francisco. He got the nickname Governor Lynch because he actually publicly defended the lynch mob and condoned their actions and said that he would fight against any potential prosecutions. Local newspapers were complicit. They actually encouraged the violence and deliberately obscured, blurred the faces on any clear photographs so as to avoid prosecution. There were some prominent men in the country who were very vocal in their criticism. Earl Warren President Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover all condemned Governor Lynch for his attitude to the event. So all of this to me sums up the mentality of mob violence. It's very, very important to point out these men have been accused. They haven't been found guilty in a court of law. But even if they had been found guilty of the crime, which was an awful crime, the behavior of the mob was just as barbaric, if not more so, than the crime. There is something I find particularly chilling about that sort of cowardly mob, sheepish mentality of. I find it terrifying, to be honest. And we're not completely immune from it in the modern world. You see examples of this still happening in the world today, and not just in developing countries. That's why I am such a staunch believer that justice has to be in a court of law. I share the sentiments of those who say that too often there's a perception that the law is on the side of criminals, and too often justice isn't sufficient. I totally, totally share that sentiment, and I share the anger from it. And like any other person, I feel deep disgust and anger when I see heinous crimes not receiving the punishment that they deserve. But I feel equal disgust when I see mob mentality taking over and people taking the law into their own hands. It can never be justified. There are certain circumstances where there is a direct sort of involvement. Say, for example, you were a parent of a child who was murdered and you saw the murderer and you killed them. That's a bit different because it's very personal. But a mob of 10,000 people, they knew of the victim. He was popular, but I think it was a sort of. I think the thing with these mob lynchings were there was sort of mass hysteria. It was mass hysteria, some sort of disease of the mind. And what I find disturbing is when you look at the old newsreels of these lynchings, there's people today who actually leave comments online saying, "Oh, we should bring this back." Who are so, as far as I'm concerned, anyone who would justify what happened in the past, those sort of lynchings, as far as I'm concerned, they're sadists. But the reason I'm quoting this case is not because, I mean, it is a particularly awful case, but by no means unique. By no means unique. I mean, the lynching of Jesse Washington in Texas, 1916, was one of the most gruesome examples, and there's many more, and many of them were photographed and actually distributed as postcards. I think one thing that I find this particularly shocking is we often associate lynchings with the Deep South, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, Louisiana, Mississippi. This was California. And the truth is, it happened all over America. And not just to black men, it also happened to white men, it happened to Hispanic men, mostly men. There were some women victims as well. But um, basically, it was a chilling example of a group dynamic where people have no responsibility for their own actions and they allow the mass to take over their thinking. Very, very scary. I find that terrifying, to be quite honest. And it's shocking that this governor, I mean, to me, it was a disgrace of an example of disgraceful political populism that he would actually condone it. Disgusting, actually, in my opinion. Now, people will say, but Nathan, what about the guy that they killed? Well, firstly, that they allegedly killed, but yeah, it was an awful crime, without doubt. But they should have been tried in the court of law and executed or imprisoned. But to be dragged from the prison before even being found guilty, I find that barbaric, and I make no apology for saying so. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm quoting this case, but I'm using it as an example to hopefully exemplify why I think that there's no point trying to convert people because people who have this sort of mindset, who allow themselves to be driven by this, they will never be converted. But it's why it's so critical that newspapers take responsibility in what they report. It's why it's so critical that we are very, very careful about fingers pointing at people before they've even been found guilty. We have to be very careful because I think mob mentality is one of the ugliest aspects of human behavior. It's also incredibly cowardly because it's a case of no individual responsibility. It's barbaric. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a dark stain on Governor Rolfe's legacy that he actually publicly condoned this. He actually got the nickname Governor Lynch. But anyway, that's a bit of history, and I just find it stomach churning. So let me know your thoughts. To be clear, I'm no liberal on crime. I'm no liberal on crime. I believe in tough justice, but it has to be in a court of law. It has to be. Because when you allow a mob to take over justice, there's no evidence, there's no care of guilt or innocence, there is no responsibility, there's just mass madness. And that's terrifying.